Hi everyone. In this podcast I talk to Tony Harrington, a respected aviation journalist based in Brisbane, Australia. Tony's been in lockdown now for nearly 2 years, as has much of Australia, but has retained a sharp interest in the Asian market and developments worldwide. It is a really interesting podcast with some great insights about the future, the availability of sustainable aviation fuel in Asia, and how challenging that will be for us all as we seek to improve the environmental aspects of the industry. Have a listen, and I hope you enjoy this one. Tony, good evening. You're in Brisbane, aren't you?
I'm in Brisbane. Good morning, John. Good evening, everybody else.
It's fascinating. Are you still locked down in Australia, or what's the latest there in terms of capacity and the recovery? Because it's been a bit stop-start, hasn't it?
It has been very much. Internationally, things are starting to trickle back in, but it's not from every market. It's very, very slow to come back in, and obviously there's been a preference for returning Australian nationals who at one stage were all locked out. But the biggest thing at the moment is that the states and territories within Australia are all acting independently. So some have let it rip, so to speak. Others are gently easing their way back in. And we have one state, Western Australia, which was going to reopen its borders, which have been closed for months, was going to reopen in February. And they've now extended that to indefinite. So you've got a situation where within Australia alone, we've got border closures and restrictions. We've had requirements for PCR tests and rapid antigen tests, but they're not available. So it's still quite a mess at the moment, and looks like it'll be that way for a little while yet.
So frustrating times, but sadly, like you, we're probably getting towards the end of our careers rather than the beginning. How did you get involved in this industry? Did you smell kerosene at the end of a runway, or did you stumble into it by accident?
No, I've always smelled kerosene, even as when I was a little kid. But I started in journalism, as many of my colleagues did before they went to airlines and came back out. Worked in regional media in Australia near Melbourne, and then joined a daily newspaper in Melbourne, The Age, and then the Australian Financial Review. And then an opportunity came up to join what was then Australian Airlines, which was then a government-owned domestic airline in Australia, as head of public affairs. And Australian then morphed into Qantas when the two were brought together. So I was with the Qantas Australian group for about 4 years. And then I started my own business, which was basically a public affairs and marketing business looking after airlines in the Australia-New Zealand region, many of whom at that stage had no representation here in the PR and marketing area. And eventually decided I wanted to go back into corporate, joined Etihad, went to Etihad up in Abu Dhabi for just under 3 years, returned to Australia, worked in aviation, or it was in tourism and transport advocacy, then returned to Abu Dhabi for another year. And then when COVID broke and they started to contract, I returned to Australia and thought, you know what, I want to get back into writing, which is what I did originally, covering aviation, and that's where I'm at now.
So, Australia has many remarkable similarities to the United Kingdom, of course, and one of those is that sort of island mentality. But the airline industry is really high profile in Australia, isn't it? I mean, I remember Alan Joyce at Qantas saying, everything is just scrutinised that Qantas do.
Look at aviation in every market, obviously, is essential, but in particular Australia, we are physically the size of the continental US. We've got states alone in here that are the size of the whole of Europe. But while we're physically that size, our population is 25.5 million. So a small population, vast distances. So a strong domestic network for a start is absolutely essential. And internationally, we refer to as the the biggest island and the smallest continent. And again, we're so far away from the Northern Hemisphere, and even from Asia. It's an 8-hour flight, 7-hour flight. So aviation is absolutely indispensable.
And that domestic market during COVID, I mean, I know you track it on a regular basis and you put out some numbers looking at the city pairs and the key trunk routes. Some of the turnarounds and some of the changes that you've seen have been remarkable, haven't you? Some really secondary routes suddenly becoming the largest routes in Australia.
It's been massive. There's a lot of variables. I guess for a start, Melbourne, Sydney, the two largest cities in Australia, Sydney 1, Melbourne 2. The Melbourne-Sydney route has always been, for as long as anybody can remember, the busiest route in the country, and obviously one of the top 3 to 5 in the world as far as domestic routes go, for forever and a day. When Melbourne went into lockdown and then Sydney simultaneously went into lockdown because they had quite significant infection rates, that took the busiest air route of the country out.
Yep.
But what that did, as well as shutting down connection between the two major cities, that's, of course, the major route in the national network. And so it absolutely tipped the network on its head. There was no feed from the likes of those cities to the Brisbanes and the Adelaides and the Perths. There was a lot of freight not moving by air. There was all sorts of things because the passenger aircraft weren't moving. Of course, there's a lot of capacity gone with that. So it came and went, and for instance, we talk about Melbourne, Sydney being number 1. It actually dropped to a ranking of 28 at the lowest peak. Now, I mean, you'd be drug tested normally for suggesting that would occur. It was just so far it had fallen, and you had the likes of Ballina, Sydney, which is northern New South Wales beach town, to Sydney, or intrastate routes within Queensland, where I am, or in Western Australia, rising into the top 10 when they had no business being in the top 100.
Amazing. Absolutely incredible. And, as a result of this, one of the things that I'm fascinated by now is what's going to happen in the recovery, and particularly in the Australian domestic market, because you've now got 5 potential domestic carriers who are either established or have aspiration to establish and start operating very soon. Is that sustainable?
I think history shows that it's not. Whether or not it does prove to be, time will tell. But obviously the Qantas group, that being Qantas and Jetstar, is by far the largest and will remain that. They are so far ahead and always have been. Virgin Australia went into administration early last year, and they emerged with new owners, Bain and Co. But they're a lot smaller now than they were. So they're still the second largest airline in the country, but they've thinned right down. They've got out of international for now, or they've suspended that. They're out of wide-body aircraft, they're out of turboprops, and they're now on all 737 operation. Then you've got Regional Express, or Rex. Now, Rex was a all-turboprop, all-Saab 340 operation, operating to regional centres around the country from various hubs. Just before COVID broke, they moved into trunk routes and took, I think it was 10 Boeing 737s. But then Virgin survived. So suddenly they were competing in a market where somebody who they may or may not have thought wouldn't be there is. And so now suddenly they're competing against Qantas and they're competing against Virgin as it's climbing back. Neither of them have any real appetite for a new competitor after what's occurred.
Sure.
And so it's very, very difficult for all of these carriers to survive on these. Well, not to survive. Qantas will survive, Virgin will survive, and Rex in its traditional routes will survive. But in terms of the major routes, how that plays out, it's a very, very expensive exercise. And then, of course, there's a new start called Bonza, who are going to commence a small number of routes with 737 Maxes. So a lot of airlines, not a lot of demand at the moment, and even if that demand came back overnight, I think it'd be fair to say that it would have to be price-driven initially just to spur the market on again.
Fascinating. And maybe we should just point out that when we say Rex, we mean Rex as in R rather than WR for the airline. But I mean,
yes, REX.
Yeah, you can't just look at Australia where you are. I mean, Asia is central to Australia in so many ways. Have you been looking at what's been going on around you and some of those markets? Because there's been some massive devastation in some parts of the region, haven't there?
Yeah, and as I say, if you look at that whole Asia Pacific region as it's described, it's a big tag, but essentially it's a lot of smaller markets. I mean, I spoke recently to one of the big leasing companies, BOC Aviation, and they said, look, they would categorise at least 8 markets within the region. You can look at North Asia, Southeast Asia, China in its own right, China domestic, China international, Oceania, which is Australia, New Zealand, Pacific Islands. So there's a lot of variations, and there are a lot of different scenarios between the airlines here, internationally and domestic. Some markets are locked down, some markets are slightly open. The interconnectivity has fallen to pieces between all of them. There are some airlines which will emerge very strong. There are some airlines which will struggle to emerge, and there are some which it's very hard to tell what they'll look like at the other side of this.
And I think, we always, and I'm going to ask you the question because everyone will want to know, your opinion on who are those that are going to struggle? Who are those that are going to struggle to get back?
I think to look at the Asia Pacific region for a start, I'd work backwards and say who are those that are going to still be there.
Yeah.
And there's one, I could look at Qantas and Air New Zealand on the Oceania side, but in terms of actually within the course of North Asia, Southeast Asia, I think the Japanese carriers and the Korean carriers will come through. Southeast Asia is the trouble area, I think. That's the area where there's been the most volatility. There's one very strong carrier in there, has been for a long time, it's Singapore Airlines Group. But all around it, there are national airlines which have, long before COVID, have been through reconstructions, they've struggled, they've had different ownership, all sorts of challenges. And you could look at Malaysia Airlines, you can look at Philippine Airlines, you can look at Thai, and Garuda Indonesia, all of which have had various struggles over the years, and I think very publicly at the moment saying that they're in reconstruction mode. And then you've got a very, very different scenario with Cathay Pacific, which was always an absolute gem in the region when Hong Kong was under British administration, and even when it transitioned to Chinese administration as a special economic zone. But the Chinese carriers also have been growing for a number of years, not just the majors that Air China, China Southern, China Eastern, but a lot of smaller, what we call smaller outside of China, but within China they're quite large anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
But they've all commenced international operations as well. So a number of those carriers have been flying in their own right now, overflying Hong Kong for a number of years, as have those majors, as they've all gained profile and built up strength and built up market penetration. And so the importance of Hong Kong as a gateway to the PRC has diminished over a period of time. And then, unfortunately, if you look at the geopolitical situation within China in recent times, that's also caused even greater issues because Cathay, Hong Kong, for a start, as a hub, has become I think very, very concerning for a lot of people who don't want to go there, and also as an end destination, its market will suffer because I think people are very cautious about going there after the disruption and all of that's occurred there. But then COVID as well, and because now the PRC is exercising a zero COVID approach, that is now also the case with Hong Kong. So Hong Kong has really, really gone into itself for a number of reasons, and Cathay's been caught up in that. And they can't really shake that off now. I think at the beginning of this year, and you'll probably be in a better position I am with the statistics you've got, but they've pulled their capacity way, way down to almost 2% of what it would normally have been.
Incredible. You mentioned the word reconstruction. Did you mean consolidation or did you mean reconstruction for some of those airlines?
I think it'll be both. I think for a start, they've got to get back on their feet before there's any interest from a consolidation perspective. But it is interesting. You talk about consolidation in Korea, for instance. Asiana and Korean are coming together, and that's basically taking two less than functioning airlines and creating one which will operate a lot more efficiently and effectively. But if you look at elsewhere in the region, they're all state-owned carriers. They're all supported, but they're all being reconstructed. And again, if I look at Malaysia Airlines, for instance, or Garuda Indonesia, both of them have struggled for quite some time in their own right. Pre-COVID, they've been reconstructed, they've had management changes, they've had all sorts of things go on. I mean, and Malaysia's also had some extraordinary challenges, such as MH370.
Yep.
Garuda's had its own challenges in other ways. But if you look at them at the moment, even though they have domestic networks which are starting to grow back, they've both got very, very strong low-cost carriers in their markets which have emerged in recent years. Now you look at Malaysia, to the AirAsia Group, which has become massive, and they just announced that they're going to have another 2 carriers start up in Southeast Asia. You look at Garuda, and they've been facing Lion Air and all sorts of other smaller carriers in their own market. So they're struggling there. And internationally, they don't have the capacity to go back to the networks that they had. So we're going to see all sorts of manoeuvring there. And one thing which has occurred is that Singapore Airlines, pre-COVID, had struck a commercial deal with Malaysia, which was not only code share, but also in technical areas such as maintenance and other areas. And they've now done a similar arrangement with Garuda. So if you look at the alliances, for instance, Singapore's in Star Alliance, Malaysia is in OneWorld, Garuda is in SkyTeam, but they're now relying on Singapore to start operating international connections for them over Singapore. So SQ will operate those flights, and the other 2 will feed into them. And in return, Singapore will have access to their domestic market. So I think it was you who said at one stage recently that it's a little like the EU. Singapore doesn't have its own domestic market. But if you look at the region, and it's the same with the Gulf carriers in a lot of ways, they don't have a domestic market, but the countries around them in their neighbourhood are effectively their international, their domestic markets.
And to your point then, I guess it's not just about airline consolidation, but there is the potential in the next couple of years for a complete rehash of the alliance structures when you've got dynamics like that taking place in Southeast Asia and probably being replicated in Northeast Asia, where you've got the consolidation that you mentioned in South Korea. Then that's going to have an alliance implication somewhere. You've got Beijing Daxing and the implications there. So the alliances are going to be re-engineered and re-equipped with new carriers probably, and some will move in and some will move out.
I think just sitting outside the circle, just to take a layman's view of it, if you look at it from the outside, the logic suggests that when you go into an alliance, it's all about network. It's all about growing your footprint. And there's no single airline that can cover the world or even hope to cover even the big slabs. So that's obviously where code sharing and alliances come in. It's to build your critical mass across networks by joining like-minded carriers.
Sure.
But a lot of those markets, most at some stage, closed down or were seriously restricted when COVID broke. They all closed down at different times or were restricted at different times in different ways. And they will all come back, if they do, in different ways and at different times. So with that has come, I think, the disintegration of the networks and the alliances to an extent. And I'm not suggesting that the alliances will fall apart, but if you look at what they offered pre-COVID, if I'm Airline A and I've entered an alliance with to get access to your network, and your network is no longer what it was, what I signed up for, and mine isn't what you signed up for, then you've got a completely different situation. So your situation will be that maybe you then start looking at partnerships of convenience, which is where you look back at the example of Singapore and Malaysia, different alliances, but what they can get from that works better for them on a bilateral basis or a commercial basis. And remembering too that Malaysia and Singapore Airlines were once one.
Yes.
They were once Malaysia-Singapore Airlines.
Yeah, flying 747s on 35-minute sectors between 2 capital cities. Crazy days, crazy days.
Running a fleet of black and yellow 707s around the region and up to the UK and up to Europe. And there are those who say, well, it was that. Will it go back to that? Will it be a back to the future situation? I'm not sure, but on paper and standing outside the circle, you would think sometimes, well, it seems to make sense.
Yeah, and I mean, changing. You could talk about those scenarios and what will and what will not happen forever, and we'll get it wrong because you always do. But you managed to escape Australia, clawed your way off the island, and went up to the Middle East. That must have been fascinating because, you know, as you were just saying, there is no domestic market. They've created markets from international connectivity. But the aircraft orders, the speed with which things were moving, you know, the dynamism that was in the marketplace, it must have been, every day must have been so exciting and challenging.
It's an extraordinary market in that central Gulf area, and some of the carriers around it as well are doing some fascinating things at the moment. But you had the big three, if you like. You had Emirates number one, Qatar number two, and Etihad number three. And they were fighting each other day in, day out. And people used to refer to, you know, the Gulf carriers as if they were one, but they were at war with each other all the time. And it was quite a commercial battle between them. But obviously, they, because of their geographic hubs, they could reach anywhere in the world with the new technology aircraft that were available. And they were ordering aircraft like they were going out of fashion. Like somebody was going to say, at midnight tonight, there'll be no more aircraft available, so buy what you can now. A one-off sale. But they were ordering them in the hundreds. And then COVID came. Etihad contracted very quickly. Emirates contracted quite quickly. Qatar continued to operate quite extensively. But if you look at it now, there's a little bit of growth coming back again. But Dubai, I believe, is back to, if not the number one airport, the number one hub internationally, then it'll be getting close to it.
Very close. Now, from a PR perspective, you know, if you were advising Qatar, who, as you say, seemed to operate throughout the beginning of the pandemic, was that a good move, or was that, you know, was that perhaps commercially not as sensible as it may seem? We know they carried cargo, but, you know, to everyone from the outside, it looked like you'd be losing a fortune. But from a PR perspective, would you want to do that?
If I had a hat on which said I'm with Qatar Airways and I looked at it, I think part of that was an opportunity for them to move into markets which previously were dominated by Emirates and potentially Etihad and others. They're well bankrolled. I mean, Qatar is a very, very sound, very, very solid financial base. They actually operated into areas that they couldn't get access to prior to COVID. For instance, I'm here in Brisbane, and Qatar were, for many, many years, denied access to Brisbane. They're now here regularly because they were still flying, as you say, with cargo and with minimal numbers of passengers coming in, but just into this market. But they've continued to fly cargo. They're now, I think, as a result of continuing to fly throughout, I'm not sure that they flew their entire network, but wherever they could, they did. Their brand is quite strong now. I think it's probably stronger in some markets than it was because people weren't really aware as much before, whereas some of the larger brand carriers, and I don't include Singapore because they continue to fly as well, but some of the larger brand carriers have pulled back and haven't returned to some of these markets and may not, or they may return on a smaller scale with smaller gauge aeroplanes. So
from what you're saying then is, from an investment perspective, if you knew you had that support behind you, then actually, as a strategy, it was a pretty smart move. You know, you solicited goodwill where previously you didn't have any. You were able to grab some market share, some of which was probably low yield, but I know yields to Australia at the height of the pandemic were sometimes 7 or 8 times higher than they were in normal times because, you know, people were desperate to get home. Capacity was restricted by the government in terms of access to Australia, and the airlines did very well in terms of yield, not in terms of total revenue. So a shrewd move.
I think so. I think, as you say, they were well financed, and I think that and not being privy to their strategy. But to me, they leveraged the opportunity. It's the old thing of never waste a good crisis. They leveraged the opportunity, and their brand now, I believe, is better known than it was prior to that. Mm-hmm. And they've established a regular presence, and also with the regulators in the various countries. They're much better known now, and they've established a presence. And so you would expect that would continue.
Yeah. So fascinating. You were up there and you got back before the pandemic and everything. But apart from the big three, or the Middle East big three, clearly the region is known for oil, and the whole issue of sustainability has for some time been in discussion. It sort of went away for maybe 18 months whilst we were worried about whether we needed to worry about sustainability. But it's back on the agenda. I know you follow it quite closely, don't you? But how is it not something that is, just a conflict in Asia and Southeast Asia more so than perhaps Australia? The dynamic of aviation growth and capacity growth and sustainable aviation, are the two mutually are they compatible?
I think that COVID has driven a wedge between the two. A lot of airlines, there was pressure before COVID, particularly coming out of Europe and to a lesser extent in the US, for emissions reductions. And you saw the Greta Thunberg movement, the FlixCar movement, really bringing that to the fore and raising the sustainability flag quite significantly and placing a lot of pressure on the airline industry, which is high profile. And I think probably a disproportionate amount of blame for emissions went onto airlines, but they're very high profile and they were really copying it beforehand. But what's happened since then is that the EU, for instance, has persisted all the way through this, saying, well, we're not going to change. Mm-hmm. We are going to stay with our rules to start bringing down emissions. We're going to start bringing in blending mandates, and it just started to occur in Sweden and Norway, now France, and New Zealand has flagged that they'll do it as well. So that's starting to occur. But the big conflict for a lot of airlines is, how do we balance our sheer need to survive with the added cost of trying to become more sustainable? And if you look at sustainable aviation fuel, it's just not available. It's in such small quantities. There's one of the major producers or distributors of sustainable fuel is Sky Energy in Amsterdam, based in Amsterdam. And they did a survey last year and they said, purely based on Europe's announced mandates up until 2050, you're going to need to build something like 300 extra refineries just in Europe just to produce the amount of sustainable fuel required purely for the mandates that have been announced. And it's way more than that if you look at it globally. So there's that issue. But, of course, sustainable fuel at the moment is very, very hard to get hold of, and it's 3 to 4 times the cost of conventional fossil fuel. So a lot of airlines at the moment particularly are saying, wow, how can we afford this? Some are now starting to step up, like, as you say, particularly in Europe. KLM is right up there. United in the US is well in the game. There's a number of carriers that have really done quite a lot. But there's others which are struggling to get anywhere near it.
To your point about Australia, being a long way from anywhere, is there a sustainable fuel supply at the moment in Australia for the airline community? No.
There's not at the moment. Qantas has announced that they are working with Air BP and other partners to try and develop that here, as is New Zealand. But I think part of that will obviously, require, while that production capacity is developed, and again, without demand, no refiner will go to the expense of setting up the infrastructure.
And of course, demand at the right price, Tony, because that's the big issue for the airlines, where this is the one cost element they have little or no control over.
And this is where governments are starting to bring in blending mandates. And IATA has come out and said, well, that's the only way it's going to occur if you say this must be met. and demand is basically forced up, then the production facilities will be built, then the money will be invested in producing it, then the volumes will start to flow, and then the price will come down. But it's a bit chicken and egg. If I'm an airline that's on the edge at the moment, am I going to start focusing on sustainable fuel, or am I going to focus on getting out of bed tomorrow morning?
Yeah, it's a no-brainer, isn't it? But you know, as an industry, we've become tarnished with it. I mean, it's another one of those PR questions for you. Did the industry not tackle the PR and get its PR right about sustainability and emissions early enough, and therefore, you know, has been kicked around a bit rather than actually taking leadership on the whole issue?
Some did. KLM, I think, flew the first, biofuel flight 10 years ago. And a number of carriers, I think, have actually led the way and been doing this for quite a while as a matter of course. Others are getting on now, getting on the bandwagon. A lot of airlines are out there announcing all sorts of initiatives, but they're really a bit greenwashing. They're really a little bit, if you scratch the surface, they're talking a lot but saying nothing. There's nothing which will stand up to scrutiny. And there's actually an interesting point to flow off that, because as well, prior to COVID, but now increasingly, because consumers, and they go back to the Fleek Scum movement and others, there's a growing consumer movement and also a corporate movement around the world to become more sustainable. And that started to result in corporations and consumers saying, well, I'm going to start looking a bit more closely at the various companies I buy from, whether it's a supermarket, fuel, whatever it is it produced sustainably and fairly? And if you look at airlines, people were starting to focus on the airline industry, and now the fund managers in particular, globally, the major fund managers are saying of the companies that they invest in, not just airlines, we don't want to know that you've got a sustainability plan. We want to know the details of it, and we want to see the outcomes. We want to see measurable, meaningful outcomes. We don't want you to say, yep, we're planting trees here, or we're doing this here or that there, because at the end of the day, offsetting is probably the only way at the moment to fill that gap between sustainable fuel and bringing on new generation aircraft, which simply haven't been built yet or are still evolving in new engines. So offsetting will take part of that. But some of that offsetting traditionally it doesn't reduce aircraft emissions. What it does is somewhere along the way is in some faraway place it will match the level of emissions with a level of recompense.
Yeah.
Whereas now, for instance, you've got situations where the whole offsetting program is evolving, where corporations and consumers can now start actually buying volumes of sustainable fuel as part of an offset, and they can pay for that to offset the amount of carbon they're emitting individually or as a corporation. So it's starting to get into more meaningful.
And, you know, sustainability is not just about fuel, is it? It's about, you know, carrying less weight on the aircraft, making things that can be recycled and reused much more easily available. You know, and the one that I always go back to is I remember KLM had an initiative where they took beer cans off the aircraft and they put a keg of Heineken beer on the aircraft and poured direct from that. Now, they may have been pandering to my own personal requirements, but, you know, it's those sort of really small things that when you multiply them all up, and KLM have been really good at that in terms of catering, dry stores, rotable equipment. And of course, no one has a paper boarding card or shouldn't have a boarding pass anymore. There's lots of other things going on that really just get forgotten about, don't they, over the scheme of things?
There's a fantastic example which really is so simple, and yet it is one that I think has made a big difference. A number of airlines around the world now, if you look at the amount of water that's carried on an aircraft for the washrooms, for instance, and the toilets and the galley, quite often airlines are carrying way, way, way more than they need, and there's a lot of weight in the water. Mm-hmm. And so research is being done now to see exactly what's needed, and the detailed research, particularly from the newer aircraft, which have got so much data, can produce so much data that's never been mined before, like the 787 and the A350. It'll tell you how much water is used on a particular flight and sector, and they're able to drill right down to the time of day, and like a night flight will use less water than a day flight, for instance.
Staggering.
Or a long flight or even seasonally, or even the route that's taken. So there's an enormous amount of weight being removed now just by scaling the amount of water that the data tells you is required for each flight. But there's one even bigger initiative which is beyond the airlines to fix, and that's airspace management.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the amount of fuel burn that is just wasted. Either, Heathrow's normally a classic in terms of flow control and just everyone getting a free trip around London 12 times before they land. But you're right. It's absolutely staggering, isn't it, that we still have all this airspace and we don't utilise it as effectively as we really could do.
The flow isn't managed properly. You'll find even between various jurisdictions, the various air traffic control authorities don't in all cases talk to each other. So in terms of handover between various regions, you look at Europe in terms of One Sky, nobody wants to surrender their air traffic control to a single body or...
it's all about sovereignty at the end of the day, isn't it?
You look at Africa, there's in excess of 50, there's the number of air traffic control regions there. There's just not a straight line through anything because they all have different thinking, different views, they don't all talk to each other. And so that would create an enormous saving just by left-hand, right-hand, by the various airspace navigation providers talking to each other and streamlining flight paths.
So
reduce the fuel burn, the emissions, and the flight times.
So talking about left hand or right hand, and conscious that we could chat forever and be at a bar hopefully and have that chat. Is your left hand optimistic? Is your right hand pessimistic about the future? As you sit there locked in Brisbane, and you look at the future and where we are now, what do you think in 5-10 years? Are we going to have an aviation industry that's back to where it was? Will it be different? Will it be better? What do you think?
There are so many variables in there. For a start, I am always one who likes to think positively, and I think from COVID, while there's a lot of negatives, I think it will force a whole lot of new thinking. So for a start, if anybody's willing to pick it up, it will force new thinking on technology, it'll force new thinking on regulation, on medical medical passes, on digitisation, and ownership and control, for instance. If you look at the number of airlines, and then going back to your point of consolidation, the number of airlines that operate at the moment, I can't see how they can all survive. I can't see how every country can have its own government airline, well, not all do, in the US, for instance, but how every country can sustain the number of airlines that they have. So I think partnerships will change. I think networks will change. And if you look at, for instance, the evolution of aircraft, the Airbus A321 is a narrow-body aircraft, but that's now being built into an extra long-range version, for instance. These things can fly as far as a lot of the wide bodies can. And in some cases where, for instance, you might have flown an A330 or a 777 once a day, it's a bit like the 767 and the 74 when they came out. Instead of flying one big aircraft once a day, you can fly two smaller aircraft twice a day or 10 flights a week instead of daily. So you can change the gauge. So I think that those sorts of things will happen. You'll see smaller aircraft flying more point to point. I think you'll see a lot more situations where, as we were talking about before, partnerships may change. Low-cost airlines are now starting to work more closely with so-called legacy carriers. Some of the smarter airlines will actually get better. I mean, I keep talking about Singapore Airlines, but they are just a very, very smart operation. They've got a long-term plan. They've got a clear view of what they want to do and how they'll do that, and they are working with others to make sure that happens. You've got the likes of Qantas, which has got a good home base here, and is thinking in terms of how it rejigs its markets, rejigs its network and its partnerships. So all of these sorts of things, I think, will evolve. The industry will change. I don't think we'll be left without an industry. I think we'll end up with a very different industry, but it will function differently. I think there'll be new networks, new routes, new partnerships, new airlines. Some of the brands that we've got now, if you look back to the days of BOAC and BEA, you look back to Pan Am, you look back to Teal, which became Air New Zealand. There's a lot of brands which have already gone, so this is not new territory for us.
No.
I think we're looking into probably a repeat of what's happened over other major changes, deregulation in the US.
Mm-hmm.
That changed things dramatically, but this is bigger than all of that. So I can see some big brands falling out. I can see some merging. I can see some surviving as brands, but being owned under new umbrella companies.
Yeah. So it sounds to me your macro view is pretty positive, but in the micro perspective, there's going to be some churn and some casualties. And I guess that leads to my final question, which is inside or out. As an aviation person and as a journalist, where would you rather be now? In an airline, looking after their PR, or outside with the ability to cast your eye around the world, look at different stories, look at what's happening, and answer raise those journalistic questions?
I think they've both got pluses. I mean, working within the industry and within airlines was a very, very exciting time, particularly since I've been lucky enough to be within airlines at various times and they've been going through great change. But outside now, I think from the journalism side, it is so interesting and evolving so quickly in so many ways. At the top end, as you said, we've talked about the big airlines and the big end of town. But you look at the small end at the moment, there's electric aircraft and there's hydrogen power. And somewhere there's a focus on electric vertical takeoff.
Yeah, exactly. Brilliant. So exciting.
Yeah, and that sort of stuff, whether it happens or not, I mean, there's something like 100 of those proposed at the moment. Nothing like that amount will get up, but some will. And if you look at the Paris Olympics in 2024 and Expo in Japan in 2025, they're both saying they will have air taxis operating then. So there's a lot going on. American Airlines has just invested in a British company, Vertical, I think it's called Vertical Aerospace. Avalon, an aircraft leasing company, ordered 500. They've already placed 350 with two airlines, Gol in Brazil and Japan Airlines. So these things are going to move. They're going to come in. Not all of them, but there are going to be takers and there will be changes. So at every end of the market, it's going to occur. I think the change will occur, but there are new markets evolving with airlines getting into what is now Uber territory.
Yeah. So it exciting and worth hanging around for. And I guess, the journalistic phrase would be hold that space, wouldn't it? Because you're going to have something. Yeah, fascinating. Tony, it's been a pleasure to speak to you, and thank you very much for your insights. And it's clear that you've got a real handle on what's going on, and it's just so refreshing to speak to someone who's so passionate about it. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks, John, and it's been a pleasure speaking to you.